Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and my guest today is Gary Steger. Gary, how are you?
Great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Gary, I've been asked to talk with you about how giving students choice in learning empowers and motivates them. How do you respond to that?
I would suggest that without choice, there's no ownership. Without ownership, there's no engagement, and without engagement, there's no learning. So as I heard presidential candidate Governor Huckabee of Arkansas yesterday say on television, we walk into a lot of classrooms where you see heads on desks because kids are sleeping and taking a very expensive nap was the term he used. That's got a lot to do with motivation. Motivation has to do with being compelled to engage in some activity that you don't find relevant or you find unpleasant. So if the educational system is based on the learner being at the center of it and therefore having free will and choice, then better learning outcomes are possible.
Is this a theme that you stress yourself in the things that you talk about?
Well, sure, I think it's all of a piece with a belief that the learner is at the center of the learning process, that there's a lot of discussion in contemporary culture about learning, and it's often preceded by the odd article "the." So I go to a lot of conferences and read a lot of articles where I refer to the learning, where I hear people referring to the learning. We need to increase the learning for students. And in the age of No Child Left Behind and a decade or so preceding it, learning ceased being a verb, something that you actively did, that you were at the center of, and became a noun, something that was done either to you or in the proximity of you with the hope that it would somehow spread. A lot of what happens in classrooms seems to be based on, a sort of viral theme of, you just have to put a pathogen or a teacher in the classroom, and then all kinds of learning will occur. As I said, I think that that the learner themselves has to construct that knowledge. It could be in a social context, but the person who learns is the learner.
So what kind of pushback do you get from educators when you bring this up? Are they concerned mostly about time or their ability to actually manage that kind of learning for all of their students?
Sure, all of it. I mean, and this is an incredibly dark period for education. The national policy seems to not only be that everyone needs to be above average, which is actually enshrined in law, but that the best way to improve educational opportunities for kids is through name calling and punitive measures. So it's hard to get people excited about anything that's pro-kid. But this is ultimately pro-teacher as well. It's a lot more interesting to teach in a classroom where the children want to be there. So I don't know, the pushback. There's not as much outright hostility because most people know, at least in their hearts, that this is the right approach. There's a more subtle pushback, which is sort of the culture of teaching, in other words, where nothing new. This sort of belief that change is geological in pace, and that I'd like to do that, but there's 1,000 reasons not to. And I think some of my work has demonstrated that a lot of those obstacles don't actually exist, but we carry them around in our heads with us anyway.
Are there good examples of where this focus on the student is working, and you feel that could be pointed to and used to help facilitate an understanding of how it would work?
Well, sure. I mean, there's countless examples, and there have been for hundreds of years. that learning, but there's this conflict between a notion, two competing views of learning. One is that it's hard, and that it's like medicine, and unnatural, and one where it suggests that it's natural to learn and that it's pleasant even when it's challenging, but that there's pleasure that can be derived from that challenge as well. So Seymour Papert views the world as approaches to education in terms of instructionism or constructionism. Instructionism meaning that you believe that you improve educational experiences and outcomes by teaching better, by buying that new piece of intelligent furniture, by buying a new workbook, by testing the kids more, by some sort of external impulse or stimuli, and constructionism, which suggests that the knowledge is constructed inside each learner, and that the best way to ensure that occurs is through the learner being engaged in the construction of something that's shareable, whether that's a papier-mâché volcano or a Lego robot or a computer program or a poem or just a good conversation, that you're creating something that either is being shared with others or has the potential to be shared with others. But there are countless examples from the Dennis Littke's big picture schools, the Met, starting with the Met in Rhode Island, and they've got about 36 schools like it around the country where there are brilliant outcomes by any legitimate measure, both on test scores and college enrollment and dropout rates and kids being excited about learning. And these are at-risk, poor urban kids. To countless others, we know that having some freedom and choice are critical to a productive context for learning. John Dewey knew this. Rousseau knew this. And yet, when we ask for examples, there's often an ideological or political bias that gets in the way of the examples being taken seriously anyway.
Why would that be?
Well, I'll answer it in sort of personal context. I do a lot of work with schools where every kid has a laptop, which is sort of an embodiment of this idea of the learner being responsible for their own learning, for there to be interdependence between learners, and for kids to be able to go further and sideways from some prescribed, proscribed set of curriculum standards or arbitrary sequence of skills they're to develop. And I've been working in laptop schools for 17 years now all over the world. I, in fact, led professional development the first 2 schools that had a laptop per kid in 1990. So I speak a lot about one-to-one computing, and there's always someone who wants evidence that this works. And there are countless studies that I can point to, some better than others, some completely bogus, that say that this works, that it's good for kids. But when you stand up in a crowded room at a conference to ask for evidence that doing something as obviously correct and right as allowing kids to have more access to computers and allowing them to learn 24/7, it's a disingenuous question. You really don't want to know that there's research that shows that this is valid. That's just a very clever way of sort of distracting people from doing what's, first of all, in the interest of kids, and second of all, inevitable. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I heard Bill Clinton. I mean, I quoted Governor Huckabee. I might as well quote another Arkansas governor. I heard Bill Clinton say, every problem in education has been solved. We know how to do everything. There are examples all over the place for how to improve achievement and then the learning environment and engage kids and recruit better teachers. And yet we don't do it, and we keep putting these sort of crisis plans in effect that make the problem worse. So, in an age of No Child Left Behind, you don't really want to know about Dennis Littke getting poor minority kids into college at astounding rates by having zero curriculum and no formal assessment, and working on apprenticeships in the community and the curriculum being related to whatever the kid wants to learn and be able to do better during their apprenticeship. That doesn't fit the worldview that suggests that school is a place with a mean old lady with a ruler and 25 little desks and one big desk.
It's interesting, as you've been talking, our oldest daughter was a very self-motivated learner, and she chose to do a great books program through a homeschool group.
Sure.
And we've always been very supportive of our local public schools, but we really felt as though we were ostracized for choosing to have a child participate in homeschooling. What's interesting about that experience is that over the last 10 years, it does feel as though it's changed a little. That homeschooling was once sort of you couldn't even bring it up, but now it becomes more and more a part of people's conversations, and maybe because homeschooling in its best form reflects some of the things that you're talking about in terms of engaged learning by the student. Do you think that there is hope? If I've seen over the last 10 years a subtle shift in the perceptions of our homeschooling our daughter, do you think people are beginning to understand the importance of some of these issues?
Oh, sure. I'll answer sort of at the micro level and then more at the macro level. The reason why I still get up in the morning and do all the things that I do, in a variety of contexts, from a prison for teens where my doctoral research was based to I do work with a number of homeschoolers. I have a little company that supports some homeschooling efforts, to private schools, public schools, urban schools, charter schools, schools in other countries, is that I want to create a variety of models that people can look at and start considering as alternatives to the status quo. And I act fairly deliberately now. I require at this point in my career that there's, at least for my own sanity, that I'm not going to be banging my head up against the wall, that I have some control over the situation. So in the past 2 years, I've done a fair amount of work with one of the public school systems in one of the states in Australia, where I asked to teach in their two worst schools, which I saw as partially a social science experiment to see what the educational bureaucracy considers their worst. But then I said, in order for me to agree to do this, I want to spend half a day in each school. I want the same group of kids assigned to me for between 2 and 3 hours each day, which means that they have to be removed from the other things that they're doing in the school during that time. And I want the group of children to be heterogeneous and multi-age. And not only do I believe that it's a good idea to group kids heterogeneously and from a variety of ages, I think they learn from each other in different ways, and I think that it's idiotic to suggest that there's something called third grade knowledge and fourth grade knowledge, or as Seymour Papert says, we group kids by similar levels excuse me, of incompetence. The goal was that if a teacher does no more than walks past my classroom and pokes their head in for a second or looks in the window and they see 3-foot-tall children and 5-foot-tall children working together for 3 hours at a time, they have to, at least for one instant, think to themselves, things need not be as they seem. That I wonder what's happening in here. That's interesting. So, that's very different from, running around trying to find 2-hour after-school workshops to do with teachers who are tired or recalcitrant or, not eager to learn about using, Word in the classroom or how to set up their teacher blog. So I'm trying to be in situations where I can do good for kids, where I can get exciting examples of what they're capable of, where I can give voice to their remarkable gifts and talents and abilities and needs and desires and wants, but also where other people can look at them and think, things need not be as they seem. Now, your homeschooling example, I think, points, there are a lot of political reasons and issues rooted in demographics and the media and such for why homeschooling is being viewed as more acceptable. But my colleague and mentor, Seymour Papert, a few years ago started talking about the learning ecology. And he took a very large sort of view of these things and thought that, even educational practices that I might find, let's see, what's the word I want to use? Noxious, like Kuman, are examples of parents engaging in the educational process of their children in an unprecedented fashion. That a parent choosing to buy Math Blaster or enroll their kid in Kumon or homeschool their kid or, take them to Sylvan or Kaplan or one of these tutoring mills. Even if I don't agree with this sort of educational approach, there's some room for optimism that there's a larger consciousness about the nature of learning that parents are engaging in. Papert called it the learning ecology, and one of the examples he gave from it was, a generation ago, or when he was a child, a couple of generations ago, your parent might say, "Don't swim in that stream because it's dirty," and now your child says, "Turn the light off, we'll save the planet." The environmental movement is only a generation or two old, and there's a sense that while you can't solve all the problems of the universe, you can flip the light switch off and make your contribution. So that I think, over the next short period, you're going to see a lot more parents being sort of willing or able to make decisions for their own kids that will more closely mirror, hopefully, the decisions that the kids would have made in the first place if we had given them that choice.
That's very interesting. One other theme that I have wondered about is Web 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I think I've noticed is that as teachers become involved in participating in the read-write aspect of the web, their own definitions of learning seem to be changing. And they're going back to the classroom and looking at the classroom and saying, this is not nearly as engaging or as exciting as what I'm experiencing and what my students are experiencing outside of the classroom. Have you noticed that at all? Do you think that I'm on the right track there?
I think what you may be observing is, if teachers are excited about learning something, that excitement about learning is contagious, and you wouldn't study carpentry with people who weren't good at it and didn't like doing it. You would study carpentry with someone who was good at carpentry, and so I think there's a mentor-apprentice issue at play there, where the teacher themselves is getting excited about using a computer and talking to her friends and sharing what happened that day via her blog or whatever the emerging technology is, and that's sort of rekindling the teacher's curiosity and excitement about learning, and that can translate into what happens in classrooms. Just like people seeing kids playing video games for months at a time have to think to themselves, well, maybe this kid doesn't have attention deficit disorder, or maybe this kid can attend to something for a long period of time. However, it's much more difficult to make the leap that concludes that this or that Web 2.0 technology is transforming learning in any particular way. In fact, in some ways, I'm fearful that it's reinforcing some really bad notions of learning.
Oh, it's very hard for me to leave the interview on that note. Can you give me a clue as to what that might be?
I think that the excitement about Web 2.0, and I share the excitement, needs to be understood in that context of the tension between instructionism and constructionism. That there's a lot of the read-write web seems to me to be a lot of I write, you read. I don't know if it's just me, but when I join a discussion online, the discussion seems to end. So there's the obvious sort of criticisms of the narcissism of the work, that I'm just sort of shouting into a well, and that could reinforce to a teacher they're the center of the shouting, for lack of a working metaphor, and it also overemphasizes the role of information in the learning process. That information is an artifact. It's not what fuels learning. Knowledge is the result of of experience, and experiences are personally constructed, and they exist in more than one form than talking to other people, although that can certainly be a form of it. So I think all of the emphasis on access to experts and all this information, and it's about the information, and what was the phrase I was objecting to yesterday? Interaction with the content, I think just reinforces the notion that knowledge is somewhere over there on that website or in that book or in that teacher, and you just need to find the way to get to it. And that's a very weak metaphor, I believe, for the educational process. So we were already heading in this direction. It's just the natural inclination of schools to want to deliver information. And the excitement about the web or Web 2.0 has just thrown gasoline on that fire. That, if the amount of information kids could have access to is infinitely greater, then there could be infinitely greater learning opportunities. Well, the opportunities might exist, but I don't see the experiences changing very much, and I still see a lot of the discussions and the writing and to be shallow, and to have been possible in other media. You could have written a letter to an author. You could have gone to you could go to a festival of books and talk to people. You could read books. Without Web 2.0, now I know there's an immediacy to it, but is that enough to then therefore conclude that there's a revolution taking place? I'm not so sure, and I think I want kids to have much more varied, deeper, richer, more personally meaningful, long-term, sustained experiences, and as I call them in my courses, learning adventures, where knowledge is the byproduct, as opposed to just having greater access to more printed text, or video for that matter. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's a great place to stop, because it still leaves the door open to further discussions, but has given you a chance to
Absolutely.
A little bit on that. Gary, thank you so much for your time.
You're most welcome. Hope it was useful. Thanks, Steve.